Good afternoon. Welcome to the second of the NMA Project Impact 2.0 Cobb Institute Health Education Series that is co-sponsored by BDO.org. I'm Randall C. Morgan Jr., and I currently serve as a member of the steering committee of the National Medical Association Project Impact 2.0. Since its founding in 1895, the National Medical Association has remained committed to the advancement and success of African American physicians. The association now has grown to represent the interest of more than 50,000 African American physicians and their patients from across the United States and the world. I was honored to serve as the 97th president of the National Medical Association, and I currently serve as the president and CEO of the W. Montague Cobb NMA Health Institute. The Institute was established in 2004 to focus upon the elimination of health disparities and, in the terminology of today, the creation of health equity. As a think tank organization focused upon research, the Cobb Institute has been a partner of both the original Project Impact, established in 1999 by the National Medical Association, and Project Impact 2.0, created in 2021, also by the National Medical Association. The primary goal of Project Impact 1.0 was to improve the validity of clinical trial data by developing strategies and techniques focused upon increasing and advocating for minority participation in every aspect of the clinical trial process. The primary goal has been to increase diversity in clinical trials. Creative programs were developed to raise the level of awareness of all patients regarding the advantages of participation in clinical trials. Over 1,000 physicians of color were trained to be clinical trial investigators and experts through the program sponsored by the National Medical Association. Project Impact 2.0 was established with the support of the pharmaceutical industry, regulatory agencies, governmental partners, healthcare providers, and community participants. It has employed new strategies of collaboration and education to enhance the health of our nation to reflect the diversity and population of the United States through participation in clinical trials. Project Impact 2.0 continues to recognize and be concerned about the lack of involvement by African Americans and other people of color in clinical trials that have contributed to health disparities. There is also the concern expressed by the NMA, the FDA, and most pharmaceutical organizations that insufficient progress has been made. Throughout the past 25 years, there's been many collaborations between the NMA and the FDA to emphasize the necessity of diversity in clinical trials for an abundance of reasons. The discussion plan for today is another of these collaborative efforts to emphasize the role and leadership taken by FDA currently to assure that the clinical trials process and the ultimate approval of pharmaceutical agents and other products created to enhance the health of our nation reflect the diversity and population of the United States. We welcome each of you to this unique midday discussion and lunch and learn. We are appreciative of the support we have received to present this discussion today by the FDA Commissioner and the leadership of this important agency. The National Medical Association, Project Impact 2.0, and the W. Montague Cobb Health Institute have the fortune of engaging with blackdoctor.org, a major health communications enterprise with a focus upon the African American community, to produce this program that we expect to have wide distribution across our nation today. The title of the program is How FDORA Implementation Strategies Impact Clinical Trials Diversity. The format for today will be a unique discussion between two of the most informed individuals in our nation about the recent program developments of the FDA and definitely all of the other aspects of the governmental regulatory agencies. We welcome Dr. Lola Fashoven-Ajay, Deputy Director and FDA Associate Director of the FDA Oncology Center of Excellence, who is in very high demand because of her knowledge of the FDA and her willingness to share that knowledge. We also welcome Dr. James Powell, co-founder and chief medical officer of KnowRx, and the PI of Project Impact 1.0, and a member of the steering committee of Project Impact 2.0 as well. Following the enlightened conversation between our speakers, we will entertain questions from the audience. Dr. Doris Brown, the chairperson of Project Impact 2.0 steering committee and the 118th president of the National Medical Association, will summarize and conclude our discussions today. We anticipate that a successful outcome of our efforts will be a more rapid integration of innovative new therapies into the care and treatment of patients that will reduce morbidity and mortality in communities of color. Project Impact 2.0 partners will benefit from expanding the recruiting potential from additional qualified clinical sites and also stronger outcomes and databases better matched to the demographics of America, thereby facilitating a broader and more rapid adoption of innovative new medications. The patients will be the ultimate beneficiary of these collaborative efforts. Thank you and enjoy the program.
Okay. Am I up, Dr. Morgan? Hello? Okay. All right. Well, I'll get going. Well, thank you all for joining us today. And one thing I would like to do before I get started, I appreciate the opportunity to be here. I appreciate your introduction, Dr. Morgan. One thing I would suggest is, well, let me back up. One of the things that Dr. Brown mentioned to me is that she wanted us to have just a conversation about the issue of clinical trial diversity and the implementation of FDORA. And to start that conversation, our title, I'd add to our title that talking about strategies of impact clinical trial diversity and minority health. I would add that to the title because the real reason we're here talking about this is the issue of the health in our diverse communities of America. So to get us started, just a conversation, I thought I was considering how to do this, and I thought I'd talk about how far we've come, okay? And it's based on my experience in dealing with this issue because I've been working on this issue for over 30 years. And really the reason I got involved, and by the way, we didn't mention it, that prior to being a part of Project Impact, I spent 24 years in the industry managing all types of clinical trials. Now, one thing is that very early on in the early 90s, there was a government regulation passed called the NIH Revitalization Act that required diversity in NIH-sponsored clinical trials. And but that particular law did not require any changes with respect to diversity in trials sponsored by the FDA, and it left me wondering what to me was a very important issue. Why would the standard for understanding medications for use in the population be in any way influenced by who pays for the trial? Whether NIH or the industry paid for it should not matter to the standard. And so I became very involved in that issue, and I'm part of creating what we call a clinical trial diversity team. And one of the real things that we were able to do and advocate for was a group of us who visited the FDA around the time of the FDA Modernization Act, when it was getting ready to be passed in 1998. One of the things that came out of that regulation was that FDA and industry should form a working group to talk about what kind of changes were necessary to the regulations in order to get better diversity in the clinical trials. So there were a few people from industry, a few people from academia, and at that time we had some conversations with regulatory authorities. But the second meeting we had a statement that basically closed the group. It says, since there's never been a statutory barrier to diversity of inclusion in clinical trials, there should be no changes in regulation. Well, of course, that didn't sit well with a lot of us, as you might imagine. So I was very pleased to have the opportunity around that time to learn about Project Impact and the National Medical Association's interest in the issue of clinical trial diversity. And I was very pleased to have the opportunity to lead the early Project Impact. And one of the things that happened is in that time was we had a consensus panel that concluded that the lack of representation by minorities in clinical trials contributes to health disparities. That was the fundamental statement of the NMA of that consensus panel in '99, and that led to a lot of actions that we took as part of Project Impact. Now, IMPACT is, Dr. Morgan may have stated, stands for Increased Minority Participation and Awareness of Clinical Trials. And part of our main objectives, first of all, is, and we've stated, is to educate patients and consumers about clinical trials, why they're important, what are the benefits and protections in that process. The other is to educate physicians about clinical trials, again, why they're important, but then also to develop them to be investigators, to participate in the trial process, so that trials that are being done to understand new medications would include the diversity of investigators. One of the fourth thing was to advocate for inclusion at every level of the clinical research process. That means not just patients, but we're talking about investigators. We're talking about members of institutional review boards to review the clinical trials, people that the FDA, medical reviewers, people that are auditing trials. So we really thought that it was important that we have representation at every level. And that's why it's I'm very, very pleased to welcome Dr. Lola Fajoyan-Ajay to our conversation. And let me give you a little bit of her background. I have it here, and I do want to share that with you. Some of it Dr. Morgan has mentioned, but Dr. Lola Fajoyan-Ajay is a medical oncologist and deputy director of the Division of Oncology and in the Office of Oncologic Diseases at the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research at FDA. In this role, she provides clinical, scientific, and regulatory policy guidance and oversight to multidisciplinary teams reviewing drugs and biologics under development for the treatment of solid tumor malignancies. Dr. Fajoyan-Ajay is also an associate director of the FDA Oncologic Center of Excellence at FDA, where she leads initiatives to address clinical and regulatory sciences and policy issues impacting oncologic drug development. And prior to joining the FDA, Dr. Fajoyan completed her undergraduate and graduate training at Columbia University and Yale University, and her MD degree from the University of Rochester School of Medicine, and she completed her postgraduate training in internal medicine and medical college at Johns Hopkins. And I wanted to mention, before I ask her to have a few comments and ask her a few questions, I'm pretty sure that one part of the progress has been that we have people like her in the agency, in decision-making roles, to give perspective on these issues. because that's been one of the things that I know that has happened over the 20 to 30 years I've been involved in this issue of discussion. So before I'm going to stop talking and just ask Dr. Fajarian to give a few comments before we start going through a few questions and having our conversation. Can't hear you.
Thank you, Dr. Powell, for that warm introduction. I know my last name is a mouthful. Please call me Lola during this webinar today, just to make things easier. Thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this discussion. I was very pleased to hear you mention the long collaboration between NMA and FDA, and I want to emphasize the importance of that collaboration and the importance of having organizations like the NMA and others really show visibility to the agency and advocate on behalf of patients who tend not to be included in research conduct here in the United States. So I am very pleased to be here to talk about some of our initiatives at the FDA. And as you nicely summarized, the initiatives around improving representation in clinical trials and clinical studies has been longstanding, but we have had limitations in the past years in the FDA's authority to require that this be an intentional, deliberate effort on the part of industry. And so in 2022, we issued, and I was pleased to be the author of this guidance, our first attempt to really try to define our expectation with respect to developing a plan that really summarizes the industry's effort around their inclusive research plan for a particular clinical development program. So the guidance in question is on diversity plans for underrepresented racial and ethnic minority populations. And we really wanted to focus specifically on race and ethnicity as a factor to be thinking about in these plans, because we've had several guidances over the years that focus on age and sex, pregnancy status, and so forth, but never one that really specifically focused on the strategy for including racial and ethnic minorities in clinical studies. And so we were very pleased that as we were putting out that guidance, that was a recommendation, as most of our guidances are. Congress was also, concurrently working to on legislation to give FDA more authority in this regard, and we worked very closely with Congress on this. And they ultimately adopted the framework that we had provided in that guidance. So we are very excited about having this new tool to really engage sponsors on very early discussions about their strategy in very specific ways that really keeps them accountable to particular goals and to the measures that they will be implementing to achieve those goals. It is a bit early to see what the outcomes of that are, because it takes many years for trials to be completed. But we're already seeing changes, even in the discussions that we're having with sponsors when they come to meet with us. And obviously, when things are a requirement, it makes people pay attention more than when something is a recommendation. So we are seeing that effort is really industry is really putting time into addressing this issue.
Well, to that point, let me get us started in our conversation. And like I said, I'd like for it to be just a conversation about the issues. I got a lot of big words about the public health and opinions regarding what needs to be done to prove a product effective. just get down to the basics. Why is this important? I have my opinion, and I'm sure you have yours. Why is this important at all to the physician and to our community?
Yeah, so just very briefly, so when sponsor wants to market a drug, they have to demonstrate to the FDA that the drug is safe and effective. And we have defined, and the regulations define what that means. And so we hold sponsors to that before we approve their drug to be marketed in the United States. In terms of the importance of diversity, we define that very broadly. It's not just racial and ethnic diversity. It's also thinking about the age of the population, thinking about the sex of the participants in the clinical studies, and geographic location of the participants in the clinical study, among many other factors, including social determinants of health, which unfortunately we are not really currently capturing as part of the data that we collect on clinical research studies, at least not the ones that are submitted to the FDA. So it's a very broad term, and it means very different things. And I think the importance of really thinking about the population that is enrolled in the clinical study is that it allows us not only to characterize and the safety and the effectiveness of the therapy in these diverse populations that are the intended, for whom these drugs are intended. It helps us to learn about the disease and the way that it can present differently across different populations, the way that it can manifest depending on these different factors. And it also can help provide access, which for some diseases where we don't have very many therapies, where there's an unmet medical need, clinical trials offer a part of the options that are available to patients, and those options should be equitably distributed across the population. So it is just important that we evaluate the therapies in the populations for whom those therapies are going to be evaluated. And that's really has been our expectation for a number of years. And these new regulations, which were part of the Food and Drug Omnibus Reform Act, or FDORA, which is a subject of today's conversation, really provides additional authority and framework for sponsors to describe what their strategy is going to be to enroll a population that reflects the intended use population in their clinical studies.
Well, to your point, one of the things I would recognize that everybody talks about the need to get the diversity in clinical trials, but one of the other things that people don't necessarily talk about as much is that that lack of data can in fact contribute to a lack of understanding of how to use those products safely and effective in the diverse community. And so that in essence, you've got a product that being approved to provide benefit, but the question is who, to whom, and sometimes if over time that you're expecting to get a benefit in a part of the population that is not there, if you don't have any, especially if that expectation has not been observed in the clinical trials process, then you can perhaps contribute to some of the disparities that we see in some conditions. For instance, if a drug to treat heart failure works in one part of the population, but not another part of the population, then there could be an expectation of benefit when in fact it may not be there for certain parts of the population. Can you comment on that at all?
Yeah, I mean, I want to be clear that we do want the population that's going to use the medical product, whether it's a drug or biological product or even a device, to be included, a medical device, to be included in the clinical studies that are really providing that primary evidence of a drug safety and effectiveness. And, the one trial hardly ever answers all the questions that we have. And so what we're trying to do is really optimize the evidence that we are collecting prior to launching that drug into the market. Because once it's launched into the market, it is used on all kinds of people, everyone, essentially, particularly if it's a drug that provides unprecedented benefits or fills an unmet medical need. And so we want to be able to really study those variable population characteristics.
Okay. Am I frozen and are you?
I think she's frozen.
The
There she's back.
prescriber
Yeah.
and the patient when making a decision about the benefits and risks of that therapy for a particular patient. That is really the goal here.
So one of the things that I really like about what was put in FDORA, there are too many people talking about representation according to population and not representation according to disease prevalence. If a good number of the people who have diabetes are African American or Asian American, then to me it is not appropriate just to focus on population representation, say 13%, when you know that perhaps even 30, 40, or 50% of the people who are suffering from the disease are from our community. What do you say to that?
Yes, I mean, I think that, what FDORA lays out is an approach to representative research that really emphasizes the prevalence of the disease and how it's distributed across the population based on these characteristics: sex, age, race, ethnicity, and others. Potentially as well. And I do agree that the approach to focusing on sort of what the US Census tells us may not be appropriate in most disease settings, because the epidemiology of the disease is what really should be informing those benchmarks that we're setting in the trial. There are some conditions where, that's not possible to do. So in the area of kind of preventive vaccines, for example, those are probably going to be informed by the population, right? That with the condition that you're trying to address and not necessarily a disease per se. We're obviously moving and evolving into an area of precision medicine. And so our understanding of the molecular underpinnings of the disease may also play a part in defining what, whom, and how many within the various subpopulations to study. So I think it's a complex thing, and it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. In the context of rare diseases, it may be you just want to get every patient you can find, and it doesn't matter who they are. You just want to get that power to be able to do a study and have the results be meaningful. So it's very context dependent. But what this legislation does, it brings that conversation to the forefront of drug development, whereas it has been historically, unfortunately, an afterthought. We're doing everything we can, and then the trial is conducted the same way it always has been, and then at the end, oops, we didn't do so well, we'll try better next time, and then it's the same thing over and over for 30, 40, 50 years now, and so I do think that this gives us an additional tool to be able to.
Well, you said something. I had a couple other questions I was going to ask you, but now you said something that generated another thought. I mean, because always the discussion is, where's the teeth? Okay, the teeth in the legislation. Because I know that in the past 20 years when we were doing this, we had a lot of efforts to train physicians, to get them involved in trials, but then for whatever reason, they were not utilized and did not get involved for whatever reason, that the sponsors didn't select them to be a part of the trials. And therefore, the many patients that they might have brought to that trial were not a part of the process. And that was unfortunate. The question is, what can you say about the teeth in this current regulation that's going to help us make a change?
I
I know
think
that's probably.
no, I mean, I think, I think what we have here is something unprecedented in that, before the trial is initiated, we have a plan from the sponsor to commit to certain enrollment goals for the trial. And I think that just going through that exercise in itself lends to a much more thoughtful approach to selecting the sites where the patients are, and to monitoring the trial while it's ongoing to determine whether or not you are meeting those benchmarks, and potentially to pivot to different approaches and measures to ensure that you can actually attain what you set out to do. So I think that there's value and strength in that itself. This legislation isn't really necessarily focused on kind of the punitive outcomes here, and that legislation as much as I do. The FDORA amends the Food and Drug Cosmetic Act, and potentially not being compliant with the requirements of that could be subject to whatever enforcement measures the FDA elects to take for a violation of the Food and Drug Cosmetic Act. Now, we obviously have enforcement discretion on many, many different things. But I think really what we're focused at the agency is getting these sponsors to think about this issue and implement it very early on in their clinical development planning, and to really show us what metrics they're trying to achieve with their plans.
I really believe very strongly that if you plan for diversity, you can achieve it. And that's really the key thing with respect to this regulation.
Yeah.
I think that, well, let me go on to the other questions because I know I'm supposed to open up to other questions from the audience, but I want to cover a couple of things. Too many people think that clinical trials are people for, you're an oncologist. Too many people think of it as the last resort. We talk about cancer trials, and I want you to disavow that and say here now that we're talking about for all kinds of conditions that impact, that have an effect on human health.
Yeah, I think I agree. I think, we don't do a great job at introducing the concept of clinical trials, clinical research early enough. I think it should be taught in elementary school and middle school.
That's what I've said for years.
Of clinical research is, and how that is how we identify treatments that improve our lives. So I do think that, particularly for cancer, introducing that concept at the most difficult time in a patient's life, sometimes it just really is not optimal. So I do think that as a community, we should be talking about it at Thanksgiving, at school, and at wherever. When it's not something that we're doing at the moment. And I think, in cancer, clinical trials are always where you get the innovation. That's where you get the new drugs. And that's where you get them first.
Well, you get the new drugs and you get the understanding of the disease.
Exactly. And you get the best care because you are being paid attention to very, very closely. Now, that's not to gloss over, obviously, past abuses. And I think we have made a lot of progress in putting in place measures that prevent the abuses of the past, right? But really, you get the best care on a clinical trial, even when you're getting the standard of care. Even when you're not getting that new drug, you're still getting the best care. And so I agree with you that it is not a last resort. It should be part of the conversation as soon as you have a disease. It should be a part of the conversation even when you don't have a disease. There are trials for vaccines that are preventative, and we should be participating in those as much as we do for the ones that are treating conditions.
Yeah. Well, one of the things we've always said at Project Impact is every physician can't be an investigator, probably shouldn't be an investigator. But every physician who enjoys the trust of patients should know enough about clinical research to be a resource to their patients, to help them make the decision of whether or not they should be involved. And to that point, I want to talk about what you think the role should be of advocacy organizations like BlackDoctors.org and other organizations, COP, in this whole process. I think you mentioned it already, educating, but go ahead.
Yeah, I think education is a big part of it. I think that putting pressure on policymakers is another part of it, to make sure that, you know, the needs of the communities that are underserved, underappreciated, where there's lacking understanding of what their priorities are, is important to bring that to greater visibility to the federal government, to policymakers, and so forth. I think that there's obviously we're dealing with an issue of misinformation a lot here, and it's been one of the priorities of our current commissioner to really address that misinformation around health information. And I do think that there's an important role for advocacy groups, for professional organizations like the NMA, to really work together with you know, in a collaborative fashion, to really counter this misinformation that's so easily so easy to disseminate, but so difficult to kind of undo. And so I think that we have to be out there at the forefront with the right information, the right cautionary information, the information that's based on science. And we have to hold those who are leaders in our communities to high standards for disseminating scientifically sound information.
Well, I understand we don't have any other questions at this time. Am I correct, Randall?
Right now, we don't, but I'm sure that some will come up. And I think also at this point that Dr. Doris Brown has joined us, and I'm certain that she may have a question at least. I have one that I can ask, but why don't we bring Dr. Brown to the panel if that's possible. While Dr. Brown is coming on, I would just like to ask, in the first year, what type of feedback has the FDA received from the pharmaceutical, companies who, of course, have been preparing for this act, and how has it been accepted? How are they functioning within the new guidelines?
Yeah, I mean, I think the experience is quite variable, as you can imagine. I think that there's some, big pharma companies who have been committed to addressing this issue for some time and had already begun doing the work that it takes to frame their strategy. But even with those, and then there's some that are still sort of trying to see what this actually means, what is the FDA going to do, and they're still kind of just being dragged along, for lack of a better way to describe the approach. I think that there are some pain points, and there's some challenges that we've heard about from sponsors, and it mostly surrounds trying to understand how FDA is going to implement this legislation, and it's very context dependent. So the context that I am most familiar with is oncology. As an oncologist, that's the area that I work on, and I work with multifunctional teams evaluating these new oncologic therapies for approval. And the reality is that the majority of these trials are enrolling participants outside the United States. Approximately 70 to 80% of the participants, sometimes 90% of the participants historically have been enrolled outside the United States. And this is our regulations allow us to accept data that is collected from foreign participants so long as it meets certain criteria conditions. The FDORA legislation has been written in a very US-centric way, understandably so. They were concerned about the lack of participation of underrepresented minorities as defined in the United States in these clinical studies. And so I think the struggle is trying to reconcile what seems to be a tension between kind of the reality on the ground that we have global trials supporting global approvals of these therapies with legislation that seems very much centered on the US and its definitions of race and ethnicity, for example, that may not always translate to other parts of the world. And so how do you go about developing a cohesive plan that meets the spirit of the legislation while also doing these global trials, which are important as well to do, because they certainly help us keep these timelines that get drugs to patients quickly. And so it's been a very interesting and really, I would say, collaborative conversation with industry, particularly those who have shown a real commitment to problem solving rather than kind of lamenting all the challenges, which has been the historical approach, to really try to figure out how do we bring these two concepts and these two realities together. Without kind of a blueprint, right, to follow. And so there are many different levers that have to all be pulled and they have to be working in sync. But, part of the strategies is really identifying new sites in the United States. We can't be going to the same, ivory tower institutions to do these trials. We have to consider when it's appropriate and safe for patients to really meet them where they are in their communities with their trusted healthcare team. And so it's been having those discussions with sponsors and putting out guidances that helps them understand what FDA would need or would require in evaluating trials that take those approaches. And it's thinking about the eligibility criteria of the study and understanding really the intended use population. And, if that population is a pancreatic cancer population and, 60% are taking pancreatic, enzyme replacement, but, none of the people on the trial are, and there's potential for interaction between the supportive treatments that people are taking. We want sponsors to be thinking proactively about those kinds of things. But I think we're still kind of struggling in this area of setting the goals, which of course is sort of the centerpiece of this legislation, which is, setting your goals prior to initiating the trials. And I think that's going to be ongoing over time, and it's going to really take a collaborative approach to figure out where we land.
Well, Lola, to that point, I've not discussed this issue before, but what do you see, or does the FDA consider it potentially having a role in working with organizations like the Cobb Institute or Impact 2.0 in gaining the involvement of those physicians in our community that have the trust of patients, and creating some strategies? Because I know that FDA is used to thinking of sponsor and interfacing with sponsors, but the other thing is, I've advocated for our community taking a little bit more of an ownership of the issue, and perhaps even working with organizations like the FDA to say, okay, let's develop what we need to address this problem in our community. What do you say to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that FDA always welcomes collaboration with any stakeholder. You know, we're here to serve the public, and we're here to learn from the public about what the needs are, and how to address those needs. I think in the area of clinical trials, because we don't run the trials, and our role really in the trials is advisory for the most part. You know, we sponsors can disregard our advice, and they often do, on many different things, not just diversity, but anything. You know, what's the standard of care? What's the control arm? You know, how large is the trial? Sponsors don't always follow FDA's recommendations, and our role really is to ensure that patients on the trial are not exposed to unreasonable risk. But beyond that, really, the sponsor is in charge of their trial, which is very different than trials that are sponsored and funded with public funds. You know, these are private entities conducting research, and so long as they're not breaking the law, it is their discretion. But what I want to emphasize is that, you know, part of the approach that we've taken at the FDA in all of our guidances is to really strongly recommend that sponsors work with patient groups, work with community organizations, work with professional organizations to ensure that the priorities and the questions that are being answered by these trials actually address what is of concern to the various communities. And that those trials are designed working together with these various stakeholders, rather than, you know, writing the protocol and then say, okay, review this protocol. Is it okay? What do you think? But to really be together working on the design of the study question as well as the trial itself.
If we still have no additional questions, so I'll ask one, and that is, what what can we do to really I know that the FDA, the FDORA requires an annual report to say, okay, what strategies, what's been the success or failure of strategies that have been put in place to get diversity. Are the successes going to be publicly available to the extent that we can know what was done to create the success and reapply it? Because I know that some industry may have, considered proprietary information, things of that nature. But at the same time, if there are successful strategies that are implemented that leads to the approval of product, is that going to be public knowledge that we can use and reapply in other places, and perhaps have our organizations and other groups participate in that to learn from what's been done in the past and put it in place in a broader sense?
Yeah, you know, the short answer is, you know, yes. I think, you know, FDA has always been committed to transparency and to sharing best practices. And we do that in a number of ways. You know, one of them is me being here and talking about our experience and where we still have a lot of work to do. You know, others is, you know, publications. And we published recently on the sponsors' experiences around developing diversity plans in a JAMA Oncology, Clinical Cancer Research Journal last year. And, you know, we do that through workshops. We do that through the many different stakeholder convenings that FDA gets invited to share information and participate in. So the short answer is that, yes, we do not plan to keep hidden all of the practices that are put in place as part of this diversity planning, particularly when we see that they're associated with a success in meeting the goals. Now, you mentioned something about, you know, sponsor proprietary information, and that is something that we have to be very cognizant of. You know, we probably can't disclose some of this information on a trial specific basis without the sponsors express permission to do that. But FDORA does something very interesting in that it actually highlights as a potential way to create transparency around these plans that sponsors can post on their own websites information about their diversity plans. And so I do think that there's a role for organizations like the NMA, like the Cobb Institute, to find out from sponsors exactly, particularly those membership organizations that represent sponsors, what is going to be their plan to provide some transparency around what strategies were used, which ones were successful, which ones were not so successful.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Morgan, did you have other questions? I understand.
Yes, as we talk about this, I think maybe some type of a report card is information that could be shared with the advocacy organizations. It's somewhat difficult to analyze a complicated process like this, unless you're really very knowledgeable. But perhaps with certain prompts, the interaction between the organizations and the pharmaceutical companies, for instance, could be, I think, enriched. There's always a concern about, are the goalposts being moved when we're not able to solve the problem the way that we like to solve it. And your comments about the number of trials that are done abroad, certainly we know those are the numbers, and Project Impact 2.0 and Cobb, NMA, many organizations have advocated for the FDA to be able to do exactly what was done in 2022 and set some new standards so that it is important to have more of the trials done in the United States with the direct reasons that Dr. Powell has laid out, I think, in some of his points. So I guess I'm still at the point of being an organizational leader and trying to understand what strategy we can carry out in 2024 that's going to strengthen FDORA, circa 2022, and to inform those constituents that we have about how they can get involved. And do you have any comments on that?
I mean, I think that there's so many things. I think one that we haven't really discussed in great detail here today has to do with kind of the community-based infrastructure for conducting clinical research and the resources that are needed to build that infrastructure and to allow that infrastructure to be meet regulatory standards, as well as the workforce that needs training in clinical research conduct, clinical research operations, and the fact that many of this would fall on physicians who are already under a lot of stress to provide care in a community setting. So I do think that this is an area that an organization like NMA could take a close look at to understand and try to explore together with sponsors how we can bring these trials closer to where people live, and to do that in a sustainable way. So we don't want, one trial here for diabetes, and then they get the trial done, and then we go, and then everyone forgets about the site, and then it's on to the next site and the next trial. But really creating an infrastructure that's sustainable over time, where research can be conducted. I think that's an area that is in need of a lot of attention.
Thank you.
I know we only have a few minutes, but I got to ask this last question. And that is, well, I don't know the last, but are you aware of any filing that has been delayed or held up as a result of lack of information, lack of diversity information in the filing in the last, I guess, year or so? And secondly, when will we expect to see something in drug snapshots that show that things have happened, the things are happening differently. When do you anticipate us being able to see that?
Wow, that's a lot of questions that are not easy at the end here.
Sorry, Denise.
Has there been a filing? I think, the standard are the results of the trial generalizable? And that's one of many factors that we consider in drug approval. Have there been times when we have said, well, in addition to many other flaws of this trial, we find that the population enrolled isn't representative? The answer is yes. Has it been the only thing? Probably not. In terms of snapshot reflecting diversity, the mandate for snapshot is to present and report on the demographics of the study population. And as I mentioned, I think it will take a little bit of time to start to see the effects of this new legislation or this new approach, manifest in differences in the trials. That's, again, it's important to remember that the diversity plan or the diversity action plan is a tool that's summarized. It doesn't make everything happen the way is written on their plan. So we hope that in the next several years, we'll start to see changes. But that's by no means the only metric, at least that I'm looking at. I'm looking at how often sponsors are actually proactively and thoughtfully thinking about where they're placing their trials as part of their trial planning and trial operations, as a step towards the right direction and a very important step.
Well, thank you very much. And I think we're we're near the end today. And first of all, I would like to say that unfortunately we had technical difficulties, that the visionary of this program was unable to join us today, Dr. Brown.
Yeah.
And so that just simply means that she'll have the opportunity to do even more on the next program. I think this, but it is important, I think, to thank all who participated and made this possible. Dr. Powell, thank you very much for all the work that you've done. Dr. Fishoran, Jay, thank you for your leadership. Thank you for being there. Please keep us involved with the NMA, with the Cobb Institute, BDO, many organizations that are very focused on the health of minorities in America. I think Dr. Powell described it best as when we started this, is that this whole endeavor is to improve the status of healthcare and to eliminate health disparities by achieving health equity. And we want it to be worldwide, but this focus has to be, I feel, much more on the United States because of the major disparities that we have at this point. So whatever we have to do to use the tools that FDA has provided for us, it's up to us and our organizations to do that in the future. We'd certainly like to invite you to come back and be with us in the future. And with that, I want to thank BDO, thank everyone that's in charge of the program, Dr. Christina Stevens and others. And we look forward to our next monthly program, which in March will be a discussion of women's health. So with that, have a good day and thank you very much.
Thank you.